Hey, everybody, welcome to Blowback. This is Brendan, and in this bonus episode of Season 4, we'll be speaking to Professor Hassan Abbas. Professor Abbas is a distinguished professor of international relations at the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. And we wanted to speak with him because he wrote a book recently called The Return of the Taliban. And it's a very comprehensive review of what's gone on inside of Afghanistan since the U.S. withdrawal and the Taliban's return to power. Much of episode 10, as you probably noticed, is based on the research and insights of this book. So here you are. Enjoy the entire interview with Dr. Hassan Abbas. Let's start from the beginning of the end, the situation in Afghanistan that led to negotiations with the Taliban. We've seen in books like The Afghanistan Papers, the book by Craig Whitlock, that by the end of the Obama administration, the general posture in Afghanistan was essentially keeping the war in suspended animation. And by the end, the Obama administration had ceased calling the Taliban the enemy. What was the transition like from Obama to Trump? Who then began the negotiations?
I would link this transition question to the broader U.S. military presence and the footprint in Middle East. And I would also link this to the Iraq war, because over a period of time, U.S. military and defense strategy focus had gone so much into the direction of Iraq that was consuming the best of minds in Pentagon, I would argue, in terms of strategy, in terms of money. And by the time there was never exit from Iraq in a sense that now we are seeing an exit from Afghanistan. But those years had distracted United States in a way, although we were always saying we can fight two wars at one time. And U.S. military and defense is huge and has not only tremendous resources at their disposal, but very professional armed forces. I've taught them and I engage with them all the time, and I work for Department of Defense. So yes, I have kind of drank the Kool-Aid in a sense, but what I have also seen is a high level of professionalism. But that was so much focus on Afghanistan that had taken away, as I had mentioned, the focus from Afghanistan. And the transition was kind of taking effect more so in the Obama administration, and especially so when I remember the moment when President Obama had mentioned a drawdown timeline, which was highly controversial, because when you give a timeline to an enemy and opponent like Taliban, who were at one time insurgent force, at another point they were more of a terrorist organization, but they were all along very focused, very strategic, and they had support base in Afghanistan. Many of our Afghan friends today don't want to hear this because they think Taliban never had the kind of local networks, which is wrong. They had those kind of things. So the transition was happening, one, because Taliban were very happy to know this is the American timeline, and they said, okay, we have to wait it out. So that was, Iraq was one thing. Giving the timeline, and I'm a big fan of President Obama and his policies and his what he brought to the U.S. foreign policy. But on case of Afghanistan, I think there were major mistakes and miscalculations that had taken place. And by the end of it, the third component of that was our choice of our friends and allies in Afghanistan, who were consistently proving to be incompetent, increasingly corrupt, and inefficient. And but some of our folks on our side, the strategists, kept on saying, no, give us 6 more months. We will turn it around. I think by 2016-17, those who were focusing on Afghanistan, or those who were following Afghanistan regularly, had a clear sense that we have lost the initiative. And because we lost the initiative by that time, that's when President Trump came in. That was the moment when the political side and the analysts and the scholars were saying, well, it is not working out the way we thought it would work out. So that's how I will define and portray that set of circumstances.
Now, by that time, Mullah Omar, the original and longtime leader of the Taliban, spiritual, political, military leader of the Taliban, had died in 2013, but they kept it a secret until 2 years later, if I'm not mistaken. So President Trump is in office by 2017. Who was in charge of the Taliban by that point? You have in your book sort of a power struggle going on within the group. What was the nature of that, and what was the aftermath like when new leadership emerged?
Thank you. It's an extremely important question, because for the Taliban, those were the defining years. What we are witnessing today had come into being, in a sense, during 2014-16 phase, in parallel to when things were not going that great on our side. And that is the time when Mullah Omar had died in a well-known or well-established hospital in Karachi. It was kept a secret. Of course, it was the Pakistani side and the Pakistani intelligence who kept that secret. And that is when Mullah Mansoor Akhtar was his deputy, and he was actually had taken over. He was a very different person than Mullah Omar, and I have profiled him in detail in the book as well. He was, you can say, at one level, far more pragmatic, far more worldly. I've explained how he was making these frequent trips to UAE, which I have not been contradicted, because I am very clear about and very sure about my sources. He made almost 24 trips to UAE, and was known to be going to different parties, going through these cycles of his links with prostitutes, alcohol. He was moving around in circles which had nothing to do with Taliban-like ideology. Mansoor Akhtar, when I asked someone, how come Mansoor Akhtar was doing all this stuff and UAE was not doing anything, and they said the issue is that he remained aviation minister during the first stint of Taliban in 1995, 96 to 2001, and he was the aviation minister, even if there were no planes or anything like that, but because he was receiving some of the royal guests, taking them on hunting streaks in Afghanistan, and that's how he made excellent relationships in UAE. So he was at the helm of affairs. Now since the book came out, also I interviewed more people. And what I've realized is that Mullah Mansoor Akhtar was very active with his links in Pakistan as well. He was very accessible. He was not a cleric in a sense, or like Mullah Hibatullah, the new leader, or Mullah Umar, who are both kind of quite rigid and quite selective in who they see. Mansoor Akhtar was roaming around, moving around. And in fact, we know that from UAE, when we tried to get hold of him, he went to Iran. He had moved his family to Iran. So look at the kind of diverse portfolio, if I may call that. He had links in Iran. He was comfortable enough to leave his family there, going regularly to Gulf countries. UAE is one. There are other countries also in the region. He was going to Qatar as well, other places as well. And I heard some senior Pakistani officials talking about him in kind of very, in a very not only friendly way, but kind of they seem to be quite fond of him, which gave me the idea that he was very accessible and open about whatever he was doing. So that was Mansoor Akhtar. And then there were others also, like Hibatullah, who was also there, who was in Quetta running a madrasa. So the clerical establishment was operating separately. Mansoor Akhtar was more of a on-the-ground strategist with excellent contacts. He was geopolitical kind of maverick in a sense. And then there were others in Afghanistan who were the field commanders. There were others who were into drug business. They all looked alike to foreigners, to outsiders, because they were wearing a certain kind of a headgear and a certain length of your beard and a certain way you talk, and everyone thinks, oh, they're all the same. No, someone is a drug dealer. Someone is like a Mansoor Akhtar kind of an operator, I would say. Other is a cleric. And they were all operating in parallel with one larger goal, to get hold of Afghanistan and to push all the foreigners out. That was the only common thing. Everything else, they had their small shops that they were doing different things.
So we've got a couple names here. We've got Mullah Mansoor Akhtar, who was the operator. And then you have Mullah Hibatullah, who was the more kind of rigid, clerically credible guy. And then, of course, you have power brokers, longtime Taliban heavy hitters in the background, like the Haqqani network and the Haqqani family. Who was in charge by the time President Trump was in office and the negotiations were getting underway?
At that time, by then, it was exposed that Mansoor Akhtar was killed in a drone strike near Quetta. So he was out, and Mullah Hibatullah had taken control of the situation, or he started trying to take control. But he was not a very powerful man. He still is not that powerful as he's projected as. At that time, it was Haqqanis, especially Siraj Haqqani, on whom there was on his head was like $10 million on his head. So he was operating actively in the area. Mullah Yaqub, who's son of Mullah Umar, was in a symbolic way made the head of the military a little bit later, but around that time he was operating. There were other people also were very active in the regional links. Currently the Deputy Minister for Defense and the Deputy Minister for Interior. These are layers of field commanders who were operating and responding to what we used to call Quetta Shura. But by then Quetta Shura means a Quetta Consultative Committee, where the top Taliban leaders were housed. They were called Quetta Shura, but by then they had dispersed. Some of them were in Karachi, some of them were close to Peshawar, some of them had moved into Afghanistan back because US had kind of all the US presence and the NATO and ISAF presence from the east and south of Afghanistan had started getting squeezed out. So by 2016 or so, the real US presence was only in the real urban centers, not in the border areas. We had moved out our kind of officers and soldiers who were, for instance, even surveilling or looking at the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. Everyone had moved back closer to Kabul. So this is the area where Taliban felt comfortable, and they started going back and forth. And of course, I should not miss the Doha presence since 2012. And there I will give actually a lot of credit to President Obama. Earlier I was critical of him, and I stand by that. But I think his vision was even at that early time. And a credit goes to Mr. Richard Holbrooke, former US diplomat. He's passed away. God bless his soul. He was a strategist who had thought through, who wanted to talk to Taliban. And he had a couple of people working with him, Wali Nasser, who's a professor, a couple of others. This team had thought about this reaching out to Taliban early on in 2012. That is when US had asked Taliban, okay, we would like to have a separate channel. We are fighting. We are on the different sides. We would like to start talking to you. That process had started in 2012 and 13. And by 2014-15, I think about 20 to 25 families of Taliban who wanted to have a neutral space before they could negotiate, they had moved into Doha. The initial phases of Doha had failed because of differences because when Karzai and Ashraf Ghani came to know about these things, they were very, very angry. They never wanted US to have a parallel dialogue with the Taliban. So that is the time when Doha was also kind of coming up as a new hub where some of the Afghan Taliban were there. Power, no one knew where the real power resided, whether in Doha or in Quetta or in Karachi or Pakistan-Afghanistan border region. I think they were all sharing power.
Well, let's take the temperature of Kabul now. A year after Mullah Omar died, President Karzai had to step down and Ashraf Ghani took over. In the same way you gave us an update on where the Taliban was by 2018-19, where was Ashraf Ghani's administration? You know, we've covered the warlordism and the corruption and all of this. I'm presuming you're not going to tell us these things were fixed under Ashraf Ghani.
No, Ashraf Ghani was kind of our guy. Ashraf Ghani was a friend of the United States. He said he will reset the stage. He will focus on good governance. But then Karzai's weaknesses started coming out. His short temper, his capacity to isolate himself. He wanted new people, Western educated Afghans to come back and serve in his team. And he did well picking up some excellent people. I know many of them. And they were all very dedicated, hardworking people. But the parallel reality was the reality of the Dostams and the Ismail Khan and Atta Muhammad Noor, who were all warlords. they would see these Western educated Afghans who meant well, but they were living in a Western world. Whereas Ashraf Ghani had to deal with the day to day reality of tribalism. And for that, he had to depend on these warlords. I have no other word other than warlords. They were these big political gangsters, basically, and the mafia chiefs. And they all survived, those mafia chiefs, and they made things more difficult for Ashraf Ghani. And Ashraf Ghani himself also, very quickly, he started becoming authoritarian as well. And we are to be blamed also. Elections were not credible. This was all helping Taliban all along. Taliban were gaining not because they had some new military strategist and some new financial resources. It was because Afghanistan, Kabul was failing.
Right. So that's the state of the Taliban. That's the state of Kabul. Now we have the negotiations themselves, which were exclusively between the United States and the Taliban. Kabul was left out. What was the timeline of this, and what were the obstacles in the way?
One, I would recommend a book which is by Carter Malkinsian on Afghanistan, which is the most credible book on that era. But I think by 2018-19, the Doha negotiations or the Doha approach was gaining more traction. And because initially President Trump tried another way. He tried to pressurize and push Pakistan. Remember, there was a tweet, I remember in late December, or I think early January in 2017, probably, if not 18, where he kind of went after the Pakistan, challenging them, okay, what are you doing? And that's soon probably he read more of the intelligence reports and everything else, that Pakistan is a player also, and a player which has helped Taliban for sure, but there are other realities as well. And he started saying, well, it will have to be a negotiated deal. And of course, we remember, he was the deal-making guy. His art of deal-making, that's what he was known for.
Well, that's also, at least superficially, very similar to his line on North Korea, which we covered last season, because he began by, calling Kim Rocket Man and saying he was going to basically blow them up. And then within a few months, he's over there and he's trying to make a deal. It was one of the biggest advances in diplomatic history with North Korea since the Korean War. But then, of course, it dissipated as well. Not so in this case.
Also, to the point, like when he showed up in Afghanistan, to emphasize your point, Brendan, right? Like he drops a huge bomb to show, like he wants both. Like he wants the bluster of the sword and to reach out with the olive branch.
Absolutely. And that's what he tried now with Afghanistan. And he said, let's talk to Taliban. Which many people before him were making that case. Richard Holbrooke was making that case. Hillary Clinton, on behalf of Richard Holbrooke, made that case to Obama. Somehow President Obama was not convinced, or somehow it fell through the cracks. But now now we had gone through a certain point. Now there was not enough public interest also in the United States. It was no more the headlines. And that is when Trump said, let's seriously talk to them. And they gave the task after actually almost a year. When President Trump came back in office, it was a year and a half. And being in D.C., we were hearing these rumors. Zalmay Khalilzad is about to get some new task. No one knew what. We knew it had to be something to do with Afghanistan. But he prepared his team. And then when he was given a task, that is when U.S. gave us good, solid signal to Taliban, we need to talk to you. And also to Doha. In fact, some of the U.S. allies, UAE, I think Turkey also, but UAE primarily was unhappy. Because they said, we are the ones who can host this negotiated deal. But Doha was getting it, and there were these internal Gulf rivalries which were at play as well. And Qatar had invested well in Taliban, because now there was a proper functioning Taliban office, and they were allowed to do whatever except proselytization, but they could go back, talk to Taliban. And so negotiations started off in a haphazard fashion, but Zalmay Khalilzad, to his credit, quickly gave a proper sense to this arena. He conveyed to Taliban that, look, we are serious, we'll talk to you directly, and Taliban said 2 or 3 conditions. The first condition was, Number one, you have to first agree that you are withdrawing, that US will completely withdraw. If that's not the starting point, we are not going to talk to you. Second thing was, we have to nothing doing with the Afghan government in Kabul. I think they had read the US mind well. At times, I think who was advising them? Maybe some in the Pakistan also, but they were, by being in Doha, I think they had access to many more people globally who someone was advising them. So that is how they started off. Zalmi Khalilzad was told very quickly by Secretary of State Pompeo and by the President, we need a deal. Go, and this is the 6 month or 9 months, we need a deal. And Zalmi started talking to them. That gave this kind of sense of urgency to Taliban as well. And they started putting their house in order. And they started getting feedback from Hibatullah. That's how, when Hibatullah started becoming important as well. Because Hibatullah was stranded, I'll not say, but kind of isolated. And now the whole clique in Doha was constantly engaging him, and messages started getting delivered. It took a year or so that this became kind of more, this effort became more clear, and this effort became more transparent also for the people within the policy. And that is the point when Zalmi Khalilzad started going to Pakistan too often. And he started telling them, look, because no one was really sure if the people we are talking to are the real ones who hold power. And those in Doha also, I believe, were not 100% sure that the field commanders will exactly listen to these things. So that is when a couple of new initiatives, if we remember, came out, which one was an Eid, on the occasion of the Muslim Eid. They said, let's have kind of this interim peace where no one will attack anyone else. And people came out, and that was the first public show of interest in peace, in a sense that they said enough of war, irrespective of who's who, because the ordinary Afghans were getting crushed between the Taliban insurgent attacks on one side and by the incompetence and corruption of the Kabul on the other hand. Money was flowing into Kabul, no one knew where was it going. Maybe in the coffers of some of the elite and the rich. And now we see that evidence in Turkey, in UAE, in Pakistan. The prices of property in Islamabad have gone up because all of these corrupt have come and purchased very prized land. Where is this money coming from? So that is when the conversation started becoming serious. And at one time, rightly, the Zalmi Khalilzad team realized that for this process to be authentic, we need representatives of the real fighters on the ground. And that's when they pushed Pakistan. And Pakistan was very happy because Pakistan said, well, we were telling you all along, negotiate. Pakistan had its own interests. They always wanted India to be out. They always wanted Afghanistan to be seen as their backyard. Because of Pakistan's geography, which is kind of elongated, they always thought of the strategic depth in Afghanistan. And there are more Pashtuns in Pakistan than in Afghanistan. So Pakistan never wanted that division to become a serious challenge for the integrity of Pakistan. So Pakistan had good, important reasons. I should not say good in a sense because that some of this was terrible for Afghans, but in the sense that from their strategic point of view. That's when Zalmi Khalilzad convinced Pakistan, we want Haqqani on the table. And that is when the Pakistani Prime Minister, Imran Khan, who's now in deep trouble, famous sportsman, he came to US. President Trump gave him a red carpet welcome. Those meetings, I remember I was in an event at the United States Institute for Peace, USIP, where Imran Khan made a speech, looked very rational. He was a smart guy. Also had a big public event. And that's when he went back. He was a cricket player, and he had in 1992 won the World Cup. So he was very popular and famous for that reason. After meeting President Trump, when he landed back in Islamabad, all his cabinet was there. People said, wow, he has brought the US-Pakistan relationship back on the track. And Imran Khan said, after meeting President Trump and coming to Pakistan, seeing everyone so happy, it feels I have won the World Cup again. I mean, that was very insightful, which means he got what he wanted. or he thought he had a good conversation with President Trump on Afghanistan and on Taliban. And mind you, Imran Khan, because some of his conservative leanings, was at one time called Taliban Khan. So people knew that he's kind of supportive of Taliban, not the Pakistani Taliban, which is one other faction, but Afghan Taliban.
Yeah.
So coming to the point, Zalme Khalilzad was able to convince Pakistan, get me one of the Haqqanis, get me one of the other important players, and Pakistan facilitated that. And that's when Doha negotiations or Doha conversations became even richer and more authentic, because people knew that yes, the people who really matter are now represented in Doha more so than before.
You've anticipated my next question, which is really could be boiled down to, what about India? We try to, as often as we can, remind listeners in our show, we can't go into everything all the time, but India is a very important factor in all of this, because it's only through India and Pakistan's relationship that you can understand Afghanistan and Pakistan's relationship. It's often said that Pakistan was most of the time using Afghanistan as strategic depth in the conflict with India. So how involved is India on the sidelines? Are they basically concluding now that if the U.S. is making a deal with the Taliban, then, we got to write this off as a loss at this point?
It's a very important question. The role of India deserves recognition, and India is a very important player with a rising global power also because of India-China rivalry. Everyone wants to know about China and India relationship. So India, very short background, India was always deeply involved in Afghanistan, but they have no common border with Afghanistan. So the history is, I'll only add a couple of points on that just to give the context. So during the time of the Cold War, the former Soviet Union, when they were in Afghanistan, that is when India was, despite calling themselves as neutral or non-aligned, that was the buzzword in that era, in 70s and 80s. India was always siding with former Soviet Union when it came to all things Afghanistan. And it was because of their old links, and also because Pakistan was deeply involved, and Pakistan was supporting and running and managing the Mujahideen, the Afghan jihad against former Soviet Union. Pakistan had a lot of say. Pakistan was a recipient of if not tens of billions of dollars every year during President Reagan. India was always feeling isolated, sidelined, at least in the context of Afghanistan. But India was always a friend of Soviet Union and had good relationship with Russia later on as well. For Pakistan, it was the opportunity to also establish their infrastructure in Afghanistan. And when Soviet Union left in 1989, that is when Pakistan moved some of its assets, some of the militants who were focusing on Kashmir, for example. Mm-hmm. Because 1989 is the time, with the fall of the former Soviet Union, US very quickly wrapped up and looked elsewhere. And US had many things to take care of in Eastern Europe. The world was changing after the end of the Cold War. And US perhaps, although we should have kept that in view, but we completely gave up on all things Afghanistan. We thought we have done what we wanted to do. And Pakistan realized now they were home to 30 to 40,000 militants who were trained and resourced for Afghanistan. And kind of the mindset was of that militant extremism, which you can't train those people or retrain them, or at least there was no such plan. Pakistan used some of them to say, okay, you are there, rather than allowing you to operate inside Pakistan or sending you back. No one wanted to go back, because these were the people who, during the Reagan administration, the Pakistani intelligence and the CIA, they had all brought people from Egypt to Malaysia to Indonesia, you name a country. These were all people who were persona non grata in their own countries. These were jihadis. No one wanted them. So they were brought in. It was like Abdullah Azam, who was the mentor of bin Laden, made more than 20 trips to New York and Boston raising funds. someone was either highly incompetent or someone was looking the other way. And so these were all now people back in Pakistan. And Pakistan said, we don't want them here. Okay, there is that Kashmir. Please, can you help us go to Kashmir and help us? Many of them returned. Every major militant group that came up in 1980s and 90s was built by or established by someone who had fought in the Afghan Jihad. I'm emphasizing this point because now we are seeing a new crisis in the shape of Daesh and others. The impact of this will come 10 years or 5 years later when we see some of the newer generation of extremists who were created or who were a product of the Daesh and the ISIS war, like we had seen in the Afghan war. So going back on this point of India at that time realized that they were out of the political game. Pakistan was calling the shots. And then there was this famous plane hijacking also, in which Indian plane was hijacked from, if I remember, Nepal or Sri Lanka. I'm forgetting one of these countries.
It was Kathmandu.
Kathmandu. Thank you so much. So the hijacking of the Indian plane from Kathmandu, landing in Afghanistan, and the demand was getting back from Indian jail Pakistani Masood Azhar, who was a terrorist in chief, who was brought back in Pakistan, was given more money to build a new organization, a new terrorist organization, starting with the name Jaish. Jaish means military. And he's still actually not on the loose, but he's still operative and active in his field, created a lot of extremism in Pakistan. And that is when Indians realized, the big beneficiary of this new militancy and extremism is actually Pakistan, because we are on the receiving end. So when 9/11 tragedy happened and US was back in Afghanistan and everything, that's when India immediately became an ally of United States, changing their old matrix or their old alliance, because they said, we are not going to allow Pakistan to have another opportunity to play. That is when India became a very important ally of US. With ISAF, NATO, later on as well, India started investing in Afghanistan. They invested hugely in infrastructure development as well, and education and other sectors as well. But Pakistan was again now looking at India as, how come India is back in Afghanistan? And Pakistanis believed that India was doing a lot of intelligence work in Afghanistan against Pakistan. So whenever there was these trilateral meetings of Pakistan, US meetings would take place, Pakistani intelligence and military would say to the US administration, look at Indians. They are supporting Baloch insurgents in Pakistan. They're acting against Pakistan from Afghanistan. And maybe half of that was true, or maybe 1/3 of that was true, but some in that range. Pakistan was exaggerating, but India was doing something without a doubt. And that because that was the reason they were in India, to counter Pakistan, keeping the history in view. So India was not a kind of innocent in a way as someone would project, but they were not doing the kind of stuff that Pakistan would now allege at that time. But India then India was very much interested in Afghanistan because of supporting democracy as well. Afghan officers started going to India for training, in other infrastructure development as well. And there was this constant Pakistan-India proxy war also that was taking place in Afghanistan. There were attacks on Indian embassy or Indian diplomats. Haqqanis were quite often involved in that, or that's what's Indians alleged. And there's likely some truth to it. And Pakistan was also probably the one who was instigating it, because Pakistan wanted India to be uncomfortable in Afghanistan. If they can't push them out, at least make them uncomfortable.
One question I have that sort of contextually is the, we haven't directly addressed the subject necessarily, or I guess of in the context of the global war on terror as it gets launched at this time. But I'm specifically also thinking of, as I guess Indian policy matures or, develops a late style, you have the Mumbai attacks. And I think that like in America, and at least certainly speaking for myself, like those have somewhat faded from view. But my impression is that they actually had a fairly serious role in continuing to shape, how the Indian government how it understands Afghanistan and what it views as the potential and continuing threat of Islamist political activity there.
Without a doubt, I think India's strategy towards Afghanistan matured over a period of time with investments for democracy, for women rights and other issues. And India became a part and parcel of the Western reconstruction project and the Western effort to resurrect Afghanistan, which we cannot deny that we spent tens of billions of dollars of taxpayers' money, and we meant well. We wanted Afghanistan to stand back on its feet, and we wanted democracy in Afghanistan. And India was a part and parcel of that strategy, and they were one of the bigger players. But in the back of their mind, there was always this interest. This is the only way, because otherwise the Pakistanis are just around the corner, and they are going to come back and create trouble for us in India as well.
Yeah.
These are also the years when some of the militants from Pakistan were more active in Kashmir and in India. The Mumbai attacks happened. I think that was more transformational than anything else. And people in South Asia don't understand much, because of kind of trying to avoid looking deep into it. But Mumbai attacks, where the Pakistani Lashkar-e-Taiba was involved, we have more evidence than needed at this time. And that kind of also convinced India further in 2008-9. Look, we need to secure Afghanistan. And India tried its best. However, India was also then become a victim because they couldn't do much about Ashraf Ghani's governance capabilities. They could invest, they could give money, but they could not change the ground realities, and Taliban were gaining ground throughout.
And I also think it's kind of interesting how, just something that hadn't occurred to me before, but a way to consider this is that, in the same way that during the Operation Cyclone years, that we think of jihad as being wielded by the U.S. as an instrument against the Soviets, I think here it feels like in Pakistan's case, the Pakistani government is basically aping the earlier U.S. policy program, except this time, against India. And it's take the long view from Pakistan's perspective, they have way less people than India. They have, they just don't have the same natural resources. So, what are the resources in, Pakistan's civil society and in Pakistan at their disposal to project that kind of power? I mean, it's fairly ingenious, I think.
We should let Dr. Abbas speak again.
I'm good. But one of the consequences of all this was that Pakistan paid through its nose in the domestic arena as well. Pakistan was, yes, copying the same US strategy during the Afghan jihad years, when Pakistan provided the platform, Pakistan provided the base. They were basically receiving money from Saudi Arabia on one side, money from Saudis, weapons from US, but handling the Afghan jihad themselves. And now there were repercussions of that, because there were now so many militant groups in Pakistan. So Pakistan, even though they, from their strategic point of view, acted smartly, they would think in Afghanistan, there was a heavy domestic price, because 80,000 people died in different terrorist attacks, and all those terrorist attacks were conducted by those militant groups which were Pakistani or local. So there was a heavy price Pakistan paid.
Absolutely. Could you actually take a moment to distinguish for our listeners the Pakistani Taliban, so-called, the TTP, right, versus the Afghan Taliban? Because it'll be good to get a quick definition for people to understand the difference between the two.
Certainly. Till the 9/11 attacks, the only Taliban we knew were the Afghan Taliban. And they were not called Afghan Taliban, they were just called Taliban. They were predominantly Pashtuns from Afghanistan, but so many of them, 30, 40, 50% of them, having trained in the Pakistani religious seminaries and madrasas over a period of time. These are the ones who were trained, educated in Pakistani madrasas during the Afghan jihad years, and had gone back into Afghanistan and built a movement which then led from 1996 to 2001. Now, at the time of 9/11, and the US going back in and dismantling Taliban, at least their infrastructure in Kabul. What they traditionally, these Pashtuns do was going back to the mountains, which they were doing it during the time of the Russia versus Britain or British colonial era. They were doing it historically for the last 500-600 years, even before that, I'm sure. But that's what is the recorded history we know. They again went back to the mountains, and these mountains are in between Pakistan and Afghanistan. These are the mountains in what used to be called Pakistani federally administered tribal areas, FATA. It's no more relevant because they have merged that into mainstream Pakistan. Yeah. That is the area where there are so many tribes which share their not only ethnicity, but their tribal nomenclature, their old family links with those Afghans. That is where many of these Taliban came back in. And this is the area where the original platform was offered to United States and Saudi Arabia and everyone else to keep the jihadis who would fight against former Soviet Union. So when they came back into this area, and this was Pakistan's folly, if nothing else. Pakistan thought they're always playing the game in Afghanistan. But in the process of offering this platform, they had militarized, they had also converted so many of the ordinary people into the militant worldview of how they view jihad and that extremist way of the world. And that these are the groups which now emerged as new small tribal groups coming under a new umbrella calling Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, which means the movement for the Pakistani Taliban. And that's from where the Pakistani Taliban came up. Mm-hmm. I was among the first one who wrote on this group in 2009. I profiled them for a West Point's publication, Sentinel, and other publications, that this is a new group, Pakistani Taliban, that are distinct from the Afghan Taliban. They have more local agendas inside Pakistan. They have excellent alliance with the Afghan Taliban. They're very close friends, family members, but they have a distinct identity because they were fighting the Pakistani military in this tribal area, and they were attacking Pakistan military, going into the Pashtun-dominated areas, and then they started conducting terrorist attacks across Pakistan. So 2009 or 2008 to 2014 was the worst period when there were hundreds of terrorist attacks every year, mostly conducted by the Pakistani Taliban. And that is the time when you would challenge Pakistani authorities by saying, what are you doing about them? And they would argue, oh, these attacks are done by the Pakistani Taliban. They have nothing to do with the Afghan Taliban. And many experts and people who were following this, including myself, we wrote policy papers on this in those years. Every month, I remember, I think most of the time that I worked during those years, I was in Boston doing my PhD, and I was in the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. All I was doing was writing paper after paper saying they're all shades of the gray. They're all linked in some way. If Pakistan will continue to support Afghan Taliban and think that is not going to have any local impact, they are wrong. And Pakistani Taliban, on the other hand, were getting energized because of their links with Afghan Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was the bridge in between this as well.
Two more questions. The first really revolves around the main question, the withdrawal itself. You know, we've spoken to people such as Malalai Joya, spoken to journalists like Ahmed Rashid, who are very critical of what went down, even though they had for years been forcefully demanding that the U.S. withdraw. Now the Taliban's back. I mean, that's not a net good for civilization. So what is your read on how the withdrawal was carried out? And not to solve all the world's problems here, but what could have been done differently? You know, because the American media was very critical. We just mentioned others who were critical. But what's something that you felt was truly avoidable, if anything?
I'm reminded of a quote, an anecdote. I was recently in Boston. I'll not name the person, but he's very well known. He's a top former U.S. strategist, a professor, founding dean of a very important school. I was presenting in my book, and he said, so what's new? Tell me in 2 minutes. It was my professor. That was the test. And I said to him, Professor, I've talked about how we messed up with withdrawal. and facilitating the return of the Taliban, and not the Taliban who we thought will go back, Mullah Brothers and others, but the others. He said, I'm not surprised. That is not news. I said, Professor, what do you mean? He said, if we were so good at that, in fighting the Taliban, there was no need for us to leave. We failed in dealing with them. So how could the end be any different than what had happened there? And I said, yes, that's an important point. But though there's a lot of critique on withdrawal, I think President Biden, not to necessarily defend his incompetence in dealing with the withdrawal, but his decision that he made, and that was not a new decision. Yeah. He used to say this to President Obama as well, that we are just wasting money. This is not going to go anywhere at the end of the day. And then President Biden knew that he was on one side facing the U.S. military, who's unlike any other countries in Middle East or South Asia or elsewhere, responds to and operates under a democratic setup. And when a military general in the U.S. is given an instruction, that is an order, and they would implement it with the best of their ability. He knew that will happen, but if you ask for their assessment, many of them continue to say, we can turn it around in 6 months to 1 year. And then there are, I'd say, it's not normally kind of politically correct in many, even in DC circles now to say, but two things, and I seriously believe those have to be discussed. One is the kind of the military industrial complex side of things, because there was a lot of money that was involved, and the contractors who made tons of money. Someone someday has to say, so who were our final strategists and the people who were working in Afghanistan? These were people who were staying there for 6 months to 1 year. There was no memory of what we were doing. That is one of the reasons why we couldn't defeat Taliban, which should have been an easy thing for us. So these contractors and military industrial base and everything else, and Biden thought, okay, the decision that was made by Trump, I agreed with. We have a negotiated deal. Let's pack up and go. And he knew that if he would give time, one of these players might make this an opportunity to say, because of some public opinion, God forbid, a terrorist attack would go off and people would say, no, we have to stay. And he would then have to keep 5,000 people. And it will be back to the square one. And he said, and in that process, some huge mistakes were committed. For instance, the Bagram Air Base, where the 5,000 Taliban were there. Al-Qaeda, Pakistani Taliban, a variety of militant groups were there. Even at my level, I knew well that about 1,000 of those 5,000 were those ones who were hardcore terrorists, which there was no way we could have released them. And that was a Trump decision to release all of them. And Zalmay Khalilzad was going there and pressurizing Ashraf Ghani to release them. I think that someone someday will have to really explain what was whether the pros and cons of this was discussed or not. But that is one element. I think President Biden thought once a decision is made, and he knew there will be major challenges, he said, okay, do it. And I know many of my friends and others in the US media and policy circles are very, very critical of withdrawal. You cannot defend that withdrawal. But we had so much time at our hand, 20 years when we were doing so many things in a step-by-step fashion and not accomplishing anything the way we wanted to. So there was no way the withdrawal could have been different. So it was bound to happen because we had decided, just let's leave. And it was better doing it quickly rather than doing in a step-by-step fashion, because the step-by-step process, since the surge of Obama and everything else we did, never worked. So probably Biden thought, still, he'll be held responsible. I think it will not impact his elections or his political base. But these are the questions which will come up with the Afghanistan War Commission, which is there. Also, purely from U.S. defense point of view, we need to investigate and see how some of the people who were made responsible for that withdrawal should have taken a stand or should have said, no, we need 3 more months.
Well, the book is The Return of the Taliban. And like I said at the top of the episode, we utilized it very much for our final episode, given that it is really one of the few, texts out there right now reporting on what has gone down in just a few years since the withdrawal. So if people are interested, it is out from Yale University Press, and it's Return of the Taliban by Dr. Hassan Abbas. And Dr. Hassan Abbas, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate the conversation.
Thank you so much. Honored to be with you.
For everyone listening, that about does it for the bonus episodes of this season. We hope you got a lot out of these interviews and some of the cultural salon episodes we did as well. And we'll see you next time. Don't forget to grab your t-shirts or whatever you want to do now. All right. Take it easy.